Welcome to episode 3 of the Morning Clam. This week we'll be talking to some guests, Ahn Sanghyun and Joanna Lynch, the author and editor of Wild Korean, which is a book that was written about learning Korean. And our other guest is Tony Hanf, and he wrote a paper called Communicative Competency in Korean. I kind of wanted to start today and ask Sanghyun some questions first about the book. Can you first just explain a little bit about what is this book, Wild Korean?
Okay, this book is basically a Korean textbook and focused on conversational Korean, and this is not for real beginners, but it is good. I think this is good material who want to learn conversational Korean, and they need it. And this book is aimed for a little bit good beginners to low intermediate people, or good intermediate people who want to learn more about conversational things.
And what are your thoughts about the book, Joanna?
Yeah, I agree. I think it's really a good book for people who kind of have already gotten into Korean a little bit, but they're not confident about speaking. So it gives a lot of situations where you can actually use it in real life.
Can you give an example of a situation?
Yeah, I think we got one about the post office, right?
Post office? Or the most basic one is like ordering food in a restaurant.
Sure, yeah. Mm-hmm.
And it is one of the most important thing because you have to eat to survive here, and sometimes people have some hard time to ordering their food. So yeah, that is one situation.
I think that's one of the things I know I can do in Korea is order food, right? You have to learn how to do that.
Also,
important, right?
Also, if you are not picky about food, you may not have any problem. But I think Korea is kind of hell for serious vegetarians because most food contains anchovy or some a little bit shrimp. So it kind of concludes that kind of situation. So that also includes some lesson for vegetarians, how to order vegetarian food in Korean restaurant.
I'm a little familiar with this book,
Okay.
but can you tell our listeners why this book is different from other Korean textbooks? Why is it called
different?
Wild Korean?
Why is it called Wild Korean? Okay, I think most Korean books want to teach good Korean. Good Korean means no. 존댓말, the formal Korean. They want to teach really basic ones, and they expect you become a good Korean speaker. Means someone who do speak only Korean in good ways.
Very polite.
And
Very polite.
proper.
And they never teach any swear word, which is used by Korean every day, not every situation, but in most cases, Koreans like to use some slangs or swear words sometimes. But I was not afraid of I was not afraid of teaching those kind of swear words, and I divided, if you are living in Korea, you may have many situations, and so I chose like 20 typical situations. For example, ordering food, or going to the post office to send a package to back home.
And dating, don't forget dating.
A lot of times when people say we're going to learn practical English or practical Korean, it doesn't usually come out to be practical, and your book seems to be everyday, actually practical applications of the language.
Yes, I think so. Yeah,
Okay.
that is what I wanted to make.
Let's turn the attention for a moment to Tony Hanf, and he wrote this your thesis about learning Korean, and what maybe you can explain it a little bit more in depth.
My paper is entitled Communicative Competence in Korean, and basically it all started with with me feeling like I've been in Korea for 4 years and I still can't speak Korean well. And so it started with this curiosity that I had, and I talked to many Korean students and people who speak English very well, many Koreans, successful learners of English. And I said, how did you learn English? And they always told me the same thing. I watched American dramas. I love watching American movies. And so I got this idea that, hey, maybe I can learn Korean if I watch Korean movies. And so what I did was, I watched 3 dramas over about a 4-month period, and I just put it on in my TV in my room, and I had a little notebook next to my bed, and English subtitles, and every time I would take notes on specific kinds of language. And communicative competence is this big construct of language, and conversational competence is one of them, which is what your book is based off of. But for mine, I wanted to improve 2 parts of my Korean, 2 weaknesses, and that was strategic competence, which is negotiating meaning, which is kind of like if you go to a restaurant and you don't want mayonnaise or pickles on your burger, you have to negotiate that communication. So saying things like, what do you mean? Or, you know what I'm saying in Korean. And the other part of communicative competence I wanted to improve was sociolinguistic competence, and specifically one part was politeness strategies. Now, I knew I wasn't going to be able to speak perfect 존댓말 at the very beginning of learning Korean, so what I did was I targeted specific strategies to say, like nice things, to be polite in Korean. So strategies for saying, how are you today? And you look very nice today, and oh, isn't the weather nice today? So saying things to build rapport with Koreans that I would interact with, and to be able to just be polite.
So Tony, you were saying earlier about your kind of direction towards your research was being very polite and learning the polite way to speak. And Sanghyun, your book is a little more wild and maybe not focused on being polite. Now the way I think about that is you have 2 not totally, but quite different aspects to learning Korean. So I'm wondering what you think about that concept.
Sure. Well, I mean, I wouldn't say that the wild Korean is not polite, but I would just say that the approach, the method is a little bit different. So this is more of a textbook approach where you have all the information right there in the book, and you just study it and practice it and use it. And with my approach, I actually use the dramas. I watch the dramas, and whenever some interesting politeness strategies, expressions, or came up, I would just take notes on it, and then I would just practice it with a language tutor, with my Korean tutor. And so I was actually extracting my own language from the dramas, because I thought Korean dramas has a very authentic source of Korean language. So I wanted to get it right from the authentic source.
Did you find that studying dramas actually gave you practical day-to-day language?
Totally, yeah. A lot of day-to-day language. And actually what I found is, after the first couple of dramas, I realized that there's only so many communication strategies and strategic competence out there that just kind of little slight variations to them, and a lot of politeness strategies, a lot of people saying polite things and doing these politeness things, but I also found that there's a lot of slang, and I started taking notes on a lot of slang, which also is in Sanghyun's book, and slang is very important for politeness too, because between friends and between close people, when you use slang, it makes you feel closer, it makes you feel good, and it's fun to use, and so it's kind of a bonding agent, I would say. And so one of my categories became slang, and another category became relationship expressions. I noticed in my Korean dramas a lot of relationship expressions, even cheesy ones like "I will love you until the end," and how can I say it in Korean? 사랑해, 끝까지 사랑해.
끝까지 사랑해.
Yeah, right.
I will love you to the end.
You're right, yeah, and little cheesy stuff. But with my Korean girlfriend, I would write these little cheesy slang, expressions down, and I would say them, and she loved it, and then I would just use that, and I could remember it, and so it was one way for me to keep improving my Korean. with that. And you know, they've got some. I'm sure they've got some cute expressions for relationships in the book too.
I have several weird expressions about those kind of things. For example, what was that lesson? It was about asking a date, and the answer. So a guy asked a date to a woman, and the answer was goalkeeper. Oh, and the girl refused it. The guy say, 골키퍼 있다고 골 안 들어가요? It means, although there is a goalkeeper, still someone can make a goal.
Just because there's a goalie doesn't mean you can't score.
Right,
Right.
exactly.
So,
So
although you have a boyfriend, I still can have a date with you if you do not mind.
I see why this is wild. Are you just
It's
trying
wild.
to? Are you just trying to help people get in the sack here, Sanghyun, or what's the?
Right. And
So I have a question for
Okay.
all of you today. Why is learning Korean so difficult?
why is learning Korean so
Well,
difficult?
let me start as if you don't mind. What I've learned in my experience with Korean is that first of all, Korean and English are completely opposite from each other. They're not even close whatsoever. Of the Korean language, 5% of the Korean words are loan words from English, but that 5% is a very small, part of the whole Korean lexicon. But with English, we have our grammar is different. So we have the beginning of the sentences where we modify what we say, our tense, our voice, our aspect. We use helping verbs and auxiliary verbs, and we soften what we say based on, am is are was were being been, have has had, do does did, shall will should could be must can could. And with Korean you do it at the end of the sentence, and you do it by manipulating. I'm sorry, I shouldn't say you do it. In the Korean language, they manipulate the suffix of the verb at the end, and so it's completely opposite concepts. And it's a little bit tricky to get your head around. But the U.S. government ranks learning Korean as the most difficult language in the world for English speakers.
I agree with Tony in some ways that it is really difficult, or at least people think it's difficult for you to totally switch the sentence order, right? Your tense or your verb always goes at the end, and subjects and objects are kind of somewhere else, and the sentence order is totally different. But once you've got that mentality, and for me it didn't take too long to catch on to that. Once you have that mentality, I think that the grammar, there's a higher learning curve. You can pick up things follow rules, where sometimes in English you feel like they don't, or you have all these phrasal verbs and things that don't always make sense. So for me, I think that Korean sometimes makes more sense. But the thing that makes Korean more difficult is the vocabulary. If I'm learning Spanish or if I'm learning French, I'm going to learn a lot faster because I can guess the words. If I hear a new word, I can kind of guess. And it takes a lot of study to be able to get to that point in Korean. So for your average beginner or intermediate or even low-level advanced Korean, second language learner, you're looking at a lot of vocabulary memorization. The life skills, things, restaurants and the post office, you pick that stuff up pretty quickly. But once you want to start reading novels, once you want to start watching the news, it gets difficult really fast.
And so what would, just to rephrase what you said before
Sure.
really quickly.
Yeah, just I think Korean is difficult because of the grammar, but I would totally agree with Joanna that once you get in that mentality, once you get that down, you just start plugging things in, and it just makes sense. And I would say it's difficult at the beginning to get your head around, and then you start to find little things, little grammar pieces, and you start picking it up, and you start just holding on to little chunks, and then you just expand upon it. And I would say that it's difficult because of the grammar, but the grammar is always there. I would also agree with the vocabulary.
Okay, so Sanghyun, same question but reversed. Why is it so difficult for Korean people to learn English?
Well, your question reminds me of 10 or 12 years ago when I went to Europe by myself. Not by myself, with a bunch of Koreans anyway. So it was after I studied English 7 or 8 years in high school and middle school, and I still had a lot of problem of speaking English to other people. So I think Koreans like to learn English to some other purpose. Other purpose means to get a job or to enter university. I think that makes learning English in Korea so hard. I think they do not find any proper way of using learning language. So the basic purpose of learning language is to communicate with other people. But they study English to get higher TOEIC score. They study English to get higher score and SAT and to go to good university. I think it is time for Koreans to change their mind. Why they learn English? Why they learn other languages? It should be to communicate, not to get a higher portion of his life or someone's life.
I know we only have a few minutes left. I wanted to ask you one more question, Sanghyun. You teach Korean class now, right?
Yes.
Can you tell me briefly a little bit about that and when that is and how someone could sign up for that?
So it is a free Korean class, and we have class on Saturday 4 p.m. and Thursday 7:30 near Sukmyeong Women's University, not in the university but near the university, and you can go to the website and check the schedule. It is kongbubang.wordpress.com. We have 5 different levels from 0 to 4, but but it is a little bit easier, level than academic classes.
And are you going to teach some wild stuff there?
It depends on the teachers.
Okay.
So nowadays, other teachers are teaching the level 2 with this book, and they are all female, and they are a little bit afraid of teaching the same material here.
And there's a second edition that just came out?
Yes, second edition just came out I published that book in the United States through the Amazon.
For a lower level, I would really recommend, there's a great website called, I think it's Let's Speak Korean. And there's an application on the iPhone.
Maybe it's talk to me in Korean.
Talk to me in Korean. Yeah, that's what it is. Yeah, it's fantastic. They got great explanations in English. They lay it out real nice for you, and they help you with vocabulary development, and they explain everything in English, and it's pretty good. So I would recommend that.
Yeah, I agree. Talk to me in Korean is great. Korean Class 101 is also excellent as well, kind of along similar veins. The way I learned Korean was not through dramas. I'm not a big TV person. I really respect you a lot to be able to watch all those. I've tried, and I don't know, I can get through maybe half a season and I just lose interest. So for me, it was much better to take classes, and this class is great, the free class, which I do attend, but I had a lot of trouble at the beginning levels because all my classmates were English speakers, native English speakers, and there's no chance to really practice it, because you just keep switching to English every time you don't understand something. So for me, I started taking classes at a hagwon, and my classmates were Japanese and Chinese, and they didn't really speak English, and they didn't want to speak English. So if we want to talk, we had to do it in Korean. And so it was kind of like this really interesting dynamic where like these, 2 non-native Korean speakers are chatting on the subway or in the restaurant in Korean, and all the Koreans are just like staring at us like, but that's how I learned Korean. It wasn't from Koreans, because at the beginning levels, you're not going to understand because they speak fast. But find somebody at the same level as you who wants to practice and just speak in Korean.
Now, one more thing before we go. I always like to do something fun at the end of the show, and so I'm going to ask 1 or 2, maybe 3 questions to all of you, and just give me a quick response. I guess it's the first question will be, what's your favorite Korean word?
Oh, my favorite Korean word. Wow, this is tough. Why don't we go to Sanghyun first?
Sanghyun?
Why didn't you ask me?
What's your favorite English word?
Yes, satisfying.
Okay, and Joanna?
Oh, Jesus. I should have thought about this before. Just the first word that popped into my head, it's not really a good word, but it's 짜증나. I'm annoyed. 짜증나.
Okay, you like that word.
It just popped into my head, but it's got a nice like ring to it, and it's got a lot. When you say it, like 짜증나, it has a lot of power to it. It really like expresses that like I'm annoyed, like something is really pissing me off.
My favorite word is cockdoogie. I love the way it sounds. I love the way it sounds.
I like that.
So did you think of
Yeah,
anything?
you know, I got one. Actually, it's not one word. It's more of an expression, and it's one of the expressions I learned from the Korean dramas. It's a communication strategy, and it is in English. I'll say it in Korean. It's 내 마음 무슨 말인지 알아요? 내 마음 무슨 말인지 알아요? In English, it is you know what I'm saying? Do you know what I mean? And it's a comprehension check that I use when I speak Korean, and I'm not quite sure if the other person understands me, so I use that. 내 마음 무슨 말인지 알아요? And I can see it in their eyes, and this foreigner's crazy. He doesn't know what he's saying, or yeah, I got what he's trying to say, even though it's a little bit broken. So I like to say that a lot, and I've practiced it, so it kind of flows off my tongue. It feels good.
Good. Okay. Next question. I always get this question from Korean people, and they always want to ask me, "What's your favorite Korean food?" So I want to flip it on its head and ask, what's your least favorite Korean food, Tony?
Bandegi.
I have never tried it, but the smell keeps me away, and I'm going to go with you, bondegi, on that one. What's your least favorite Korean food?
I think bondegi was the first thing also that popped into my brain. I'm trying to think if there's something else I don't like. Yeah, I can't.
3 strikes, you're out, bondegi.
Yeah, bondegi.
Bondegi.
Yeah,
Okay,
bondegi.
Pretty gross.
and Sanghyun, what is your least favorite, we're all
Least
American, we'll say American food.
The problem is I do not know what American food is.
That is a problem. Maybe
Yeah, nobody
the
knows,
next podcast.
yeah.
All right. Well, I want to thank everybody for coming, and I will try to put links to your book on Amazon
Okay.
and links to your Korean class, and I will try to share some link to your thesis when it's up and
When it's up and published.
when it's published. And I want to really thank you guys a lot. I thought it was a good discussion. We kind of just grazed the top of the topic, so I think there's a lot more that we could be discussing, but I really appreciate your insight and coming in and finishing up this 3rd episode of The Morning Clam. So for The Morning Clam, this is Aaron Martinson signing off. Thanks a lot.